Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute podcast. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. In this episode, Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications, and I had a conversation with Laurence Jurdem, author of the new book, Paving the Way for Reagan, The Influence of Conservative Media on U.S. Foreign Policy. Does the media really influence presidents? Based on Laurence's research, the publication's Human Events, National Review, and Commentary had a significant influence on President Reagan. From the Nicaraguan Contras to dealing with the Soviet Union, Laurence takes us through some of the major foreign policy issues of the 1980s and how these major publications impacted President Reagan. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to PRI's podcast, Laurence.
Hey, thanks. It's great to be here, and thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
So lots of books have been written about the 40th President Ronald Reagan, but yours stands out, in my opinion, because it's not the usual biography or the history book, but you actually chronicle the influence of three major publications, National Review, Human Events, and Commentary, and their influence on Ronald Reagan's foreign policy. So what was the genesis for writing this book?
Well, I'd always been a fan of Bill Buckley's. I had been reading his columns regularly, maybe since the 90s. And when I began my doctoral program at Fordham in the fall of 2008, I had thought about Buckley as a possible topic because it's really interesting if you think about it. I mean, this was a man who was responsible for transforming the Republican Party, who had written dozens of books, thousands of columns. He'd been on television for decades, on Firing Line, interviewed tons of guests, and yet I found it so fascinating. There had been very, very little actually written about him. So when I was considering my dissertation, I thought that he would be a really interesting person to write about. And ironically, he died a number of months after I began my doctoral studies. And of course, his obituary was on the front of the New York Times. There was all this commentary about him. And so when I went to meet with my dissertation director, we thought about the idea of writing about Buckley in some respect. I had always been really interested in political power, how it was acquired, how it was used. And Buckley was an extremely influential and powerful figure. And I thought that what about writing a dissertation about the influence of National Review and Bill Buckley on Republican foreign policy. However, what I didn't realize until I began researching the project was somebody else was publishing a book on Bill Buckley and National Review. So I realized I needed to make it a little different, and that's where Human Events and Commentary came in, and that's essentially how the project developed.
So let's go through some of these notable publications, and let's start with Human Events, which was founded in 1944. Ronald Reagan was an avid reader of Human Events decades before he was elected president. And you write that when some of the more moderate staff members tried to stop his subscription at the White House, I mean, it's kind of a wild thing to imagine these days, Reagan started having it delivered to the White House on weekends. So how did Human Events help to shape Reagan's foreign policy?
Well, Tim, that was one of the really interesting things that I discovered in my research was how passionate President Reagan was about Human Events. Reagan read Human Events religiously. Everything that was in there, he took as gospel. He gave a special celebration for Human Events in the White House during his presidency. And in his remarks, he literally said that in reading Human Events, one gets a sense of the world as it really is. And that speech actually can be found online. You can actually look it up and actually watch Reagan deliver those remarks and actually hear those comments. And in fact, some advisors said that Reagan trusted Human Events more than the intelligence briefs he was actually receiving. I mean, if he saw an article that he thought was important in Human Events, which was sort of a tabloid newspaper, he would tear it out. He would give it to the appropriate person in the administration. Human Events was just a really, really interesting newspaper. It really helped and clarified Reagan's views on a lot of different issues. It was strongly anti-communist. It was very vocal on issues like tax policy. And one of the areas that may have influenced President Reagan, and this was not something that I did a great deal of research in, was on Nicaragua. And from the outset of the communist revolution there, the newspaper was writing, huge headlines about Central America, El Salvador, Nicaragua, saying saying things like, oh, is El Salvador the next to go? Reagan would read these headlines and he would get very concerned, particularly when he read that Nicaragua was eliminating, the Sandinista government was eliminating free enterprise and it was sending military assistance to help other wars of liberation in Central America. And a few months later, William Casey then suggested the idea of supporting the Nicaraguan Contras. Now, intellectual history is an interesting thing because we have no way to know or pinpoint, was this something that really influenced Reagan in his policy in Nicaragua? But it's certainly sort of an interesting idea to think about. So that in what was one of the ways that human events influenced Reagan. Human events could also be very critical about President Reagan, particularly in the latter part of his administration when he was meeting with Soviet leader Gorbachev. They could be really hard on him. I mean, the headlines could be very, very brutal, and it really bothered Reagan a lot. Pat Buchanan actually told me a story that when Reagan was at Reykjavik and he saw a headline in Human Events that he didn't like, he was visibly angry. But one of the great things about Ronald Reagan was that he was able to go outside his ideology. And if he believed he was doing something that was great for the country and the conservative media disagreed with it, well, that's the way it is.
Laurence, so your book covers a great deal on the relationship between Reagan and Bill Buckley and, of course, the National Review. Bill Buckley was both a great friend and advisor to Ronald Reagan. Several of his speechwriters, including Aaron Bakshian and Tony Dolan, who I worked for back in the days when I was a research assistant, they were both former writers from National Review. Powerful was Bill Buckley and National Review's influence during the Reagan years.
Reagan and Buckley had a long friendship. The two met one another in 1961, and that friendship really lasted from 61 up through the rest of President Reagan's active life. Reagan had been an early subscriber to National Review. It started in 1955, and Reagan was one of the early subscribers to the magazine. He read it as he was traveling the country on a train. Reagan was afraid of flying, and he traveled the country quite a bit, either in automobile or on the railroad when he was working for General Electric, and he would read the magazine. He was a great fan of James Burnham's, who was the foreign policy analyst for the magazine, and someone Reagan said when he gave Burnham the Medal of Freedom in 1983 that he had quoted him extensively while he was on what Reagan called the mashed potato circuit. When Reagan became president, it's an interesting question about how much influence Buckley and the magazine had on Reagan. Reagan had been, as I said, reading about these ideas for such a long time that they almost became second nature to him. When he went into the White House, he had a large number of people, probably within the among the lower staff. I mean, somebody such as research assistants like you, Rowena, who we never really talked about this, but a lot of people in the Reagan administration had been reading National Review from a very, very young age, had been watching Bill Buckley on firing line, and were very influenced by him in one way or another. It's hard to know what Reagan actually read, what articles sort of really resonated with him. But when I spoke to Aram Bakshian, we were talking about that, and he said that with Reagan, the speeches that Reagan gave, there was a tone. You know, there's not a real strong paper trail saying, oh, Reagan read this article in National Review or that article in National Review, but there was a tone, there was a presence. It was clearly felt. When Reagan gave a speech to Parliament in 1982, he talked about these ideas, what became known as the Reagan Doctrine. It was a speech that had been written by Bakshian, had been a speech that had been written by Anthony Dolan and George Will. The speech that Reagan gave to the Council of the Evangelicals in 1983, where he used that phrase, the evil empire, had also been written by Anthony Dolan. These were very highly ideological speeches. And as I said, they possessed a certain tone that was symbolic of the ideas and the principles that were expressed in National Review.
So you devote a chapter in your book to the Panama Canal Treaty, when the U.S. gave back the canal to Panama. And what I think is very interesting is that Reagan and Buckley weren't on the same side on this issue. And there's a famous anecdote that Buckley came out to the Reagan house in L.A. for dinner one night, and before their dinner, Reagan told him to be on the lookout for a surprise as he drove up. And Reagan famously put out Burma shave signs along the way up that said, "We built it, we paid for it, it's ours." So talk to our listeners about this, very public foreign policy disagreement between the two?
The canal is an interesting subject. It had come into Reagan's focus during his insurgency run for the 1976 GOP nomination against President Ford. To many of the folks on the right, the canal represented this history of industrial ingenuity, this great ambition of the United States. And the idea that we were going to be giving it away created a lot of anger, as I said, particularly among those within the conservative movement who believed the loss of the canal was another example of American retreat. Remember, the Vietnam War had only ended a few years before, and initially Buckley shared Reagan's view. In 1964, he had written that, in his view, the land that the canal was on belonged to the United States. And when Reagan made the canal a key part of his presidential campaign in the summer of 1976, Buckley voiced his support against the idea, as I said, of Ford returning the canal to Panama. But in the fall of that year, Buckley decided he would go to Panama and examine the issue for himself. This sort of had been motivated by conversations he had with Barry Goldwater and Henry Kissinger. And so when Buckley went to Panama, he met with officials of the Panamanian government, and over time, during his visit there, he came to realize that not only was there an incredible reverence with which the country perceived the international waterway, but they viewed its return as an important part of their country's history. And as Buckley wrote about it, he said that by the canal being returned to Panama, it would be a magical restoration of the nation's dignity. Buckley also had spent a lot of his life in Mexico growing up. His father had been an oil man, had done quite a number of business down there. And Buckley had a great deal of love and reverence for Central America and Mexico and all across Latin America. And nobody's really sure what the reason was that he suddenly changed his mind. I mean, obviously what I've said is a legitimate reason. But when I spoke with different people at National Review, they really couldn't come up with a legitimate reason as to why Buckley changed his mind. They often said at times he could be a real contrarian about different things and kind of liked to stir the pot just to keep people a little gingered up about different opinions and perhaps create a bit of an argument. Now, Reagan didn't see Buckley's position, didn't agree with that position at all. He, like many others, and as I said, including many of the editors at National Review, believed that the U.S. was allowing itself to not only be bullied by a very, very tiny third world country, but lose control of strategically vital international waterway, a vital resource. And that upset a lot of these folks. They believed that Panama's dictator was this sort of tin pot character who was sympathetic to Marxist ideas. But in the end, as we might recall from that very famous firing line debate that anybody who can go online and watch on C-SPAN or just type it online, Reagan's views did win the day as far as the audience was concerned. And in fact, the amount of negative editorials and letters that Buckley and his colleagues received at National Review were really quite something. I mean, it certainly raised people's interest in Bill Buckley if they weren't interested already, and it certainly gave a lot of PR to National Review, even if it may not have been the most positive in the world.
Commentary was another publication that had a profound influence on President Reagan's approach to dealing with communism. In your book, you write that it's where Reagan actually discovered the writings of Jeane Kirkpatrick and Richard Pipe, and he later brought them to his administration. Talk about their impact before and during his administration.
Well, Commentary was the neoconservative magazine. It was actually, for me, it was a magazine that came into was the last part of the idea of the dissertation. I had picked, as I said, National Review, which was sort of the modern conservatism, we can argue, Human Events, which was what one could refer to as the old right, and Commentary, which was the magazine that represented the neoconservative point of view within the Republican Party. These articles and these intellectuals, Kirkpatrick and Pipes in particular, came into Reagan's orbit through his foreign policy advisor, Richard Allen. Richard Allen said to me that essentially Reagan would read any article that Allen put in front of him. Reagan was a very curious guy. He was interested in conservative ideas. He loved to read, and he was always interested in conservative ideas and international issues. And in fact, Alan often said to me on one occasion that Nancy Reagan got a little annoyed at him because he would give Reagan all this material to take home with him on the weekends, which Reagan, funnily enough, dubbed his homework. And Nancy Reagan would get frustrated occasionally because she would see Reagan sitting at this table with this huge pile of paper, reading and underlining and scribbling on it, and they couldn't go out and do fun things that she maybe wanted to do. Both Pipes and Kirkpatrick had written articles for commentary in the late 70s that were critical of what they believed was a fundamental weakness in U.S. foreign policy. As I said, Allen gave these pieces to Reagan, and after he read them, he expressed interest in these two foreign policy experts to have as advisors in his presidential campaign in the late 70s. Ultimately, both Kirkpatrick and Pipes ended up serving in the administration. Kirkpatrick served as ambassador to the UN. Pipes was an aide to the National Security Council focusing on Soviet and Eastern European issues. And you also had other contributors like Elliott Abrams, who had a variety of different diplomatic positions, and Carl Gershman, who served as an aide to Kirkpatrick and the UN. And going back to what I talked about earlier about the speech that Reagan gave when he addressed Parliament in 1982, a lot of that, let's call it background or the arguments that Reagan made had come from a memo that Richard Pipes had submitted to the National Security Council based on an article that he had written in commentaries called Soviet Global Strategy, an article Reagan had read, or an article that he was very enthusiastic about, to the point that he underlined it and wrote in the margins when he gave it to Ed Meese that he was, quote, very, very happy that Pipes was working with us. So commentary had a pretty large impact on Reagan's worldview and on many of the positions that were part of the foundation, I think, of Reagan's foreign policy.
So let's fast forward to the current president. President Trump likes to bash the press, but who in the media or what publications, if any, would you say that President Trump relies on most for his foreign policy worldview?
So President Trump is a big reader of the New York Post. It is for him what many have called the paper of record. Oddly enough, like Human Events, it's a tabloid, and the Post really is a newspaper that has really chronicled Trump's life when he was a New York personality. I know that from what I've read, he also reads the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Again, papers he would have been familiar with, having spent his life in New York and working in the city's real estate community. As we've seen, I think, throughout this administration, the president is extremely conscious of his image. And from what I have read, he has an excellent memory for certain journalists, particularly those who have written about him over the years. During the campaign, he had, I guess the campaign employed an electronic clipping service, which I think his staff would print out and give to Mr. Trump, and then Trump would take a Sharpie and annotate this whole thing and essentially find articles that he thought were interesting, or maybe have read an article, and if he didn't like that article, he would make a note and tell an aide how he or she should respond to that particular article. It really reminds me of a type of presidential news summary, something that I'm assuming that Trump may be using today in the White House. It's something that President Nixon used quite a bit to get a sense of what the media response was like to his personality and his policies. And it was really the only thing that President Nixon read on a daily basis. And just like President Trump, Mr. Nixon wrote on it a great deal. He told aides which articles should be responded to. And Trump has a great fascination with Fox News. It's something that I wrote about a couple of weeks ago in the Washington Post. He's a huge TV viewer of Fox and Friends, of Sean Hannity. I know from what I've read, he consults with quite a number of these individuals at various points during the week. So it's quite clear that Fox and those personalities, as well as the New York Post, have a very large effect on him.
Lawrence, how about the last president, President Obama? Do you think his foreign or even his domestic policies were influenced by the media?
So from what I've in reading about that, I gather that President Obama was a voracious reader. He was also, like so many other presidents we've had, very conscious of the way he and his policies were perceived and portrayed by the press. It's interesting that you really did have two generations. If you think about the differences in the viewings of President Trump and President Obama, President Trump refuses to use a computer and he relies a lot on TV news and television commentary. Obama was known to read these things on his iPad and was someone who was known not to really watch television much at all. From what I know, I believe President Obama obviously he read the New York Times, he read the Washington Post, he loved his Chicago papers, the Chicago Sun-Times and the Tribune, and obviously loved to follow his hometown Chicago White Sox. And when he also read long-form magazines like The Economist and The New Yorker. But I believe he also liked to sit down with different journalists, I know he sat down in the past with Peggy Noonan. I believe he sat down in the past with David Brooks over on the right. But he also met with quite a number of these blogger types over on the left. And he'd love to get an overall view of what different folks in the media were writing about and what they were thinking.
So say you were a special assistant to the White House these days, in charge of President Trump's cable TV, print, and Twitter feed. Who and which outlets would you put on his list?
Well, I think one of the things that's important that I would try to emphasize is I would really try to emphasize the idea of balance in what he read and what he watched. As I said in the last point, he loves reading the New York Post, which is on the right, but maybe I could convince him to read the New York Daily News, which is over on the left. He loves Fox on the right. Maybe I could convince him to watch the PBS NewsHour, which tends to present views from both sides. I might also have him read National Review and the Weekly Standard, neither publication I believe he is a fan of. But since there is so much debate about Trump and his policies, especially among those within the conservative press, it might be helpful for him to get a sense of where various branches of the conservative movement are in regards to his presidency. What I might try to do, which I don't know how long I would last in the White House as I did this, I think I might actually swipe his phone for a little bit just to see maybe if I could convince him to end this tweeting for at least 5 minutes, so we all might be able to get a little bit of peace. But I have to say, in thinking about what I might have him read, I think obviously the most important thing is I would certainly have him listen to the PRI podcast.
Thank you. So, it's our tradition at PRI to ask every podcast guest for a cocktail, wine, or beer recommendation for our listeners as our last question. So, as you know, we're a think tank, and we know what a relief it is when authors finally get their book out. And so yours launched July 23rd. What are you drinking these days to celebrate?
Well, there is a vineyard in Washington State called Silver Oak, and they make a really terrific Cabernet. And so that's what I find myself always trying to, I try to find it and try to drink it whenever I can.
Thanks for joining us, Laurence.
Thanks, Rowena. I appreciate it. And Tim, thanks so much for your questions.
Thanks to our guest, Laurence Jurdem, and to my colleague, Tim Anaya. You'll find Lawrence's new book on Amazon.com and other booksellers. And if you're in the Southern California area, please join us Thursday, September 13th for our annual Baroness Thatcher Gala in Newport Beach. This year, we're honoring Governor Pete Wilson on his 85th birthday. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for another episode of PRI's podcast.